Elizabeth Betsy Whitaker assumed the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs in September 2005. This marked Whitaker's return to the Bureau, where she had previously served as Director of the Office of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs from 2001 to 2003, and prior to that in assignments in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Immediately prior to assuming her current position, she served as Director of Policy Planning and Resources for the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, heading an office which she established at the request of department leadership. From 2003 to 2004, she worked as Deputy Executive Secretary in the department's Executive Secretariat. Whitaker joined the Foreign Service in 1984 as a public diplomacy officer with the United States Information Agency. I might also mention in her previous career before the Foreign Service, she taught social studies and English at a high school level. In addition to Central American tours, she has served in Portugal, and her Washington tours include USIA as the Central American Desk Officer, Operations Center Watch Officer, Executive Assistant to the Counselor of the agency, and Chief of the Training Division. Since the consolidation of USIA into the Department of State in 1999, she has served as a Senior-Level Career Development Officer and as a graduate of the Senior Seminar. Whitaker is the recipient of numerous superior and meritorious honor awards and holds the Senior Foreign Service rank of Minister Counselor. She is married to Senior Foreign Service Officer Kevin Whitaker, who is currently serving as Deputy Chief of Mission in Caracas, Venezuela. So in a way, you could say they're doing a little bit of commuting. They have one son, Daniel, who's age 12, contrary to what's printed on the bio publicly, who pitches and plays outfield on a Babe Ruth all-star team, who I also understand, with his parents, keeping in mind he's becoming good at soccer. So please join us in welcoming Elizabeth Whitaker, Latin America and the Left.
Hi. It's nice to see you all. I am terrifically pleased to be here with you all. This is my first time in Utah, where I understand you get less snow than my hometown, Buffalo, New York. And it really is, I feel particularly honored to be with a group of people or an institution that places such attention to the Foreign Service and the work of our diplomatic corps overseas. I will tell you my own experience is that a lot of times when I tell folks all around the country that I work for the State Department, they want to know which state I'm talking about. So it happens. Certainly, I'm clear on what you all want me to talk about today, and I'm happy to do that. But let me just add a couple points. One, I'd hope that it's not just me talking. I can think of nothing more boring myself, and I know many of you bring significant overseas experience to the table, and I'd love to hear your reactions, your comments, your thoughts. This should be a dialogue. That's the real benefit for me. It's always the more interesting part. And the other is that listening to my bio again, which I've got to start shortening, it makes me sound way older than I think I am, that because I do have 21 years in the Foreign Service and also experience as a public diplomacy officer, that if those are areas that is the career of a diplomat or what we're doing in public diplomacy around the world, what about the U.S. image? While those remarks aren't within what I prepared for today, I'm more than happy to talk about those things too. That's very close to my heart and also something I think a lot about. So, but let me start out this afternoon by acknowledging something, and that is the United States has a pretty controversial past in the Western Hemisphere. We get that. Let's all acknowledge that. And we could sit here today and talk about whether we ran the Cuba Missile Crisis properly, about the Dominican Republic in 1965, about Daniel Ortega's revolution in 1979, and whether we did the right thing in declaring our support for that revolution and then turning around and changing our minds. I mean, we can do that. But I'll tell you my own bias today is that maybe we can start to look ahead. I like to think that we have learned from our past. And I'm not here to try to whitewash or to rewrite history. That's not what the State Department's about, contrary to belief among some. But I think that since we've got limited time, and I'm told you will simply get up from your chairs at 10 of 3 and leave. So in anticipation of that, maybe we could talk about the future. What's going on? What's the future? A more productive discussion to see about where we go from here and what role you and we can play in the hemisphere. But for starters, our policy in the Western Hemisphere is based on on something pretty basic, and that's what we as Americans think works best. It's that simple. We think that representative democracy and free markets work best. And that's because those have worked pretty well for us for the last 230 years, and we think they're important principles. America stands for this. It's not a magic wand. We can't expect results by next Tuesday, let alone overnight. And we as Americans tend to want immediate results and get frustrated when we can't see things turn around. But we've got to get used to that. We need to remember that we have 230 years of experience with our own, and during which time we've made our own mistakes. We've had our own missteps. And so I think one thing that we need to take into consideration is that as we try to promulgate this agenda for the hemisphere of democracy and free markets, we need to understand that we've had a lot of time to sort of wrestle with these issues and tweak them and try to get them right. And I'm not sure we're done yet. I don't think we are. Another thing that we've had in our favor, in addition to time, is leadership. Because for democracies and free markets to realize their full potential, you need the will to make and to let institutions and systems work. And at times that habit of democracy has, in the Western Hemisphere, been lacking. And we can all think of examples. You can look at Fujimori in Peru. You can look at Fujimori, of course, who tried to use some of the systems in place, some of the institutions to try to stay in power. You look at the situation in Nicaragua. Since I've served there, I follow that, and I probably talk about way too much about it, but we've got a situation there where President Arnoldo Alemán, elected in 1996, someone who, as I mentioned at lunch today, had been imprisoned by the Sandinistas and whose wife passed away while he was imprisoned. Elected in 1996 on a pro-democracy platform, 2 years later signed an agreement with the Sandinistas to kind of negotiate between Daniel Ortega and himself who would have power and how they would run the country. And certainly we have the situation in Venezuela. I'm sure you've all been reading about that. Hugo Chavez has changed the Constitution, for example, as he sees fit and expects, and I use his own words, to stay in power until 2030. I mention these examples because I think we have to ask ourselves, is this or are these examples the form of government that we, as Americans, think works best? Now, that's sort of a principled response, what we stand for. But we also have to think about our own self-interest as a nation. I think it's fair to say that to the extent Latin American leaders don't respect the laws and institutions of their own countries, abuse the rights of their citizens, and perhaps, this is something we hear a lot about now, fail to create opportunities for their people, we will continue to see those people wanting to leave that country to places where there are opportunities. Certainly the United States is a favorite target. And I think that's a twofold negative. One, it's a drain of talent, manpower for the losing country. And the other point is, of course, something that we're all reading about in the headlines today, and that is the debate over immigration in this country. We have concerns about whether or not we're controlling immigration in this country, even though we are a nation built on the work of immigrants. Again, I'm not saying the United States is perfect. Our democracy has had its own trials, but we have had institutions and leaderships and systems of correction that, by and large, function as they should. I certainly have to include the role of the media as one of those institutions. Its role in promoting transparency since the days of Watergate and Iran-Contra has been a very healthy and educational thing. So with all of this policy statement, why do some say that we're in trouble in the hemisphere? Well, I guess I'm going to take issue with that assertion. I want to point out just a couple of points of light. You've got to note that there are some signs of hope in Latin America of its commitment to democracy and to free markets. Here are a few. 34 out of 35 countries in this hemisphere are governed by democratically elected leaders. Whether they're ruling democratically is another issue, but these are democratically elected leaders. We have 34 out of 35 countries which signed actually on another day that will live in infamy, September 11th, 2001, in Lima, Peru, signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The charter says simply, the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. Democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas. This is the only region in the world that imposes an obligation to defend democracy. I should also note that last fall at Mar del Plata, at the last Summit of the Americas, 33 out of the 34 countries assembled there reaffirmed their commitment to the Inter-American Democratic Charter. So for all of its growing pains, it's sort of a miracle of history that we find ourselves today speaking about the consolidation of liberty in the Western Hemisphere. Now, how that happens is going to be different in every country, and we get that. There are other points of light. There is regional economic growth, this year estimated to be 4.3%, which is the third such year of growth over 4%. We have NAFTA coming of age at 11, which accounts for, under which we see $2.2 billion, that's with a B, dollars in trade daily among the countries involved. We have a CAFTA agreement, which is, as some of you know, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, also includes the Dominican Republic, just signed, in the process of being implemented. We have bilateral trade agreements with Chile and pending negotiations with Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. We have poverty reduction in countries which have braved economic reform and invested in their people. Mexico, for example, cut its poverty rate, and by that I mean the percentage of people who live on less than $2 a day. Mexico cut its poverty rate from 41.3% to 21.3%. Brazil from 33.1% to 22.4%. In both countries, in Mexico a program called Oportunidades, and in Brazil a program called Bolsa Familia, offered incentives to the most marginalized members of society to try to keep their kids in school and to get them health care as possible. So families are getting money to keep their kids in school and keep them healthy. I would also note poverty reduction, very impressive statistics in Chile and Costa Rica. So as I said, I think we've got some points of light. All of that poverty reduction and growth is not necessarily universal through the hemisphere. It's true. And indeed, the UN just this month said that poverty still affects 40% of Latin America, and that's 200 million people. That's too many. What's been the reaction to all of this? You read in the headlines that the hemisphere is going left, that Hugo Chavez is building a coalition in this hemisphere that will, come to confrontation, perhaps even to war with the United States. And I guess while we read about that in the press, in our free and unfettered press, I guess what I would say, I don't think this is really any kind of confrontation between the left and the right. I think what we're really looking at is populism, or voices of frustration that democracy and free markets haven't delivered on the promise. Populism is a completely legitimate historical phenomenon. In fact, if you recall from your American history lessons, we had our own bout of populism, which produced progressive legislation at the beginning of the 19th century and certainly influenced a lot of the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. Political figures like Chavez, Humala in Peru, AMLO in Mexico, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua are using this frustration as a theme in their campaigns, and that worries some Americans. As I said, there are headlines all over the place that the hemisphere is going left. I think it would be useful for us to think about why that worries us. But we, in the U.S. government, at the State Department, we understand the frustration. We really do. And we think that the big challenges we face are not left-right, or Chavez, or Castro, or Ortega, but really the issues of poverty, social exclusion, and the inability of some societies, to deliver the goods and services that people need and expect in order to have opportunities to improve their lives. Again, it's not left-right. It's about leadership. It's about strengthening democratic institutions. It's about linking democracy to social development and opportunity. It can be done by leaders to the right, as President Uribe in Colombia has shown us, as President Arias in Costa Rica is showing us, or the left, as President Lagos in Chile did during his administration and President Lula in Brazil is doing. So as such, when the U.S. government, when the State Department looks around the hemisphere, we're basically looking to work wherever we can to help our neighbors find their own way on a path that we as a people think is the way to go. Now, I was asked to speak a little bit about specific countries, and I will do that, and then I'm going to wrap up so that I can get some of your questions and comments. But in keeping with that idea of how do we work in partnership on that path that we as Americans think is the way to go, and not just U.S. Americans. Again, think back what I said to the fact that we've got an inter-American democratic charter which has been acclaimed by almost all of these countries in the hemisphere, and we've got growth and free trade agreements flowering. When we look at Bolivia, newly elected leader Evo Morales, a lot of populist rhetoric if you were watching that campaign at all. He has since been inaugurated, and we're delighted to see that we have a dialogue. We, from the secretary on down, have a dialogue with President Morales. We think it still remains to be seen what he's going to do now that he's taken power. Politics is new to Morales. We really don't have a clear idea of what he's got in mind. Our suspicion is he may not be entirely clear of where he wants to take his country. But the dialogue is established and very important to us. And as such, we wait, we watch, we hope, we offer assistance as is palatable to Morales. But we're optimistic that this left-of-center leader may also hear the demands of his own people and take the actions necessary to provide them the opportunities we all think they should have. Similarly, in Chile, the recent inauguration of Michelle Bachelet as the president, the door is wide open to dialogue. And we're very optimistic that she will follow in the footsteps of Ricardo Lagos, her predecessor, who is somewhat left of center, but someone who also understood the obligation to work within the society, to listen to the people, and also uphold and sustain the institutions. Cuba was the third country I was asked to say a few words about, and that is certainly one of the most polarizing issues in the United States, and in no small measure due to the fact that we have a significant domestic component in that issue. And if you don't know what I mean by that, raise your hand. Okay, we can skip over that then. The fact is, U.S. policy is that we remain very hopeful for and committed to a peaceful transition to democracy in Cuba someday. We do hear the criticisms of the current policy. We do hear the criticisms of the embargo and those who feel that, why shouldn't we be able to trade or send whatever we want to the Cubans? The answer, the political answer, the answer of the policy is simply concern that whatever dollars are sent or spent in the regime or on the island go to supporting the Castro regime. We also hear the concerns about the ban on tourists. Wouldn't it be better if Americans could just go there and sort of through osmosis spread the dream of democracy? And I didn't mean that to sound snotty, really. The fact is, though, that since the early 90s to the present, no fewer than 15 million tourists from Europe and Canada have visited Cuba. 15 million. Those are societies, countries that I think are equally dedicated to the principles of democracy and free markets. And so the question is, and I think a logical one, would it make that much difference if we added Americans to the mix? It might. And hence begins the debate, which I don't know that we want to get into today unless you really want to. Intelligent people can disagree and certainly do disagree on Cuba. But again, we hope, we are optimistic to work, we're optimistic that freedom will someday come to Cuba. And there, as in Venezuela, we're working where we can. And in Venezuela, we understand the fact that Venezuela is in the middle of a huge political transition. The big challenge for Venezuela now is how it's going to work through that transition, how it rebuilds the political consensus that brought Chavez into power but has fractured since and allows Venezuela to continue its modernization process. Despite what you might read in some papers or hear from some commentators, we are not trying to isolate Venezuela. Venezuela and the United States are natural partners, both from a business perspective. We get 15% of all our imported oil from Venezuela, and Venezuela buys over $5 billion in U.S. products every day. We've also been partners for a long time from a governance perspective. We have a long-standing historic relationship with all sectors of Venezuelan society. Governmental and non-governmental institutions, universities, faith-based institutions, the armed forces, and political parties. Venezuela has been, since 1958, a democratic constitutional country. Whatever problems its democracy might have had, the United States has had a political and economic relationship with that country that we've had with very few other countries. So even as Venezuela works through very tough moments, it is not in our interest to walk away. This is a relationship that is in our interest and benefit to maintain over time. So we remain open to engagement with Venezuela, and we work in the spaces where we can to express our concern over the state of health of its democratic institutions and the ability of the Venezuelan people to have their rights respected and their voices heard. So while Chavez and Castro and Ortega and others who espouse this populist rhetoric get a lot of attention, we think that actually the real leadership in this hemisphere is in other pockets and in lots of other pockets. It's in Brazil, it's in Colombia and Argentina, it's in El Salvador and Chile and Mexico, it's in Peru and Uruguay and many other countries, perhaps at different levels of strength. But in each of those cases, we do see that the leaders there are building institutions, generating economic growth, creating opportunities, and making their countries more competitive in the global marketplace. It may very well be in Bolivia and Chile. It may very well eventually be in Venezuela and Cuba. We hope so. But the pace and style and approach toward democracy and free markets is going to be unique to each country, even though the direction is the same. And that is a direction toward democracy and social justice that, as I said at the beginning, we think it's important to stand for in the hemisphere. And that's all I have to say formally.